Chapter 2581. The Tibetan mastiffs behind Daisy crashed into the iron cage, and the sudden clank scared her into losing her balance and staggering a few steps before bumping into the man standing behind her. The man took advantage of the situation and hugged her. "Don't worry, we won't hurt the baby in your womb." A hint of coldness flashed across Daisy's eyes, but she held back the feeling of disgust and tried to stay calm. "Wait, this isn't exciting enough." The three men were startled. "Yo, you actually have a fetish for something more exciting." Daisy turned around, stared at them, raised her eyebrows, and gave off a seductive smirk. "Miss Taylor has always wanted to see my downfall with her own eyes, hasn't she? I can only give you guys my best performance when she's around." The three men did not expect her to be so bold and wild. Anyway, she was alone and could not run away from them anymore, so three of them decided to send one of them away to report this situation to Cecilia. Daisy wrapped her arm around one of the men's shoulders and asked with a slightly coquettish tone, "Will these two dogs break out of the cage and come out to ruin the fun later?" The man sniffed her hair and could not help but feel a slight itch deep down. "Of course not. Don't worry. This cage has been properly locked." Daisy took a glance at the iron cage, and the corner of her lips curled upward coldly. "Glad to hear that." At this time, Cecilia came in with the man that went out earlier. "Miss Vanderbilt, I didn't expect you to be such a savage. You actually invited me here to witness your happy moment. I was originally worried that this bitch would lead someone here, so I hid elsewhere first and left these three dudes here to entertain her. However, if Daisy has really come alone, she's no match for these three men. So, as long as they've confirmed that she's not brought anyone else here, then I can show up and take videos and pictures of what's about to happen. I'll even send it to Nales for appreciation." But who would have known that she'd be so proactive? Seeing that Mia was not by Cecilia's side, Daisy narrowed her eyes. "If you can show me that Mia is safe and sound, we can start at any time." Cecilia snorted unconcernedly and glanced at one of the men. The man went out of the room and brought Mia in not long after. Mia's hands were bound, and her mouth was sealed with tape. Seeing that Daisy had actually come for her, she cried and whined. Cecilia looked at her. "How does she look?" Daisy nodded and weighed. "Bring her out. After all, I don't want her to witness what's about to happen. I only want to make sure that she's still alive." Cecilia motioned the man to bring Mia out of the room. Daisy took off her coat unhurriedly and pretended to remind her out of kindness, "By the way, Miss Taylor, if you don't want to stain your eyes, you can leave too." Cecilia sneered. "You've invited me here to watch, so how can I say no to that? Besides, you're the one who's asked for my presence, so you can't blame me for being here now." She walked up to a chair, sat down, and crossed her legs. "It's time to start. Why are you three still standing there in a trance?" Seeing that Daisy had thrown her coat on the ground and was giving off such firm determination, the slight fear that they had felt deep down disappeared, and they approached her while rubbing their hands. Daisy slowly retreated to the side of the iron cage, and when they were only a foot or two away from her, Daisy abruptly pulled the latch of the iron cage, and the door of the cage was opened in an instant. The famished Tibetan mastiffs rushed straight toward the men. They were caught off guard as the dogs pounced, mauled, and bit them. They screamed, at the top of their lungs, "Ah, help!" Daisy took the opportunity to get into the cage, closed the door, locked it, and watched the scene in horror. Cecilia screamed in terror, got up from the chair, and ran out. She was kicked back into the house when she reached the door. It was Nales, but before she could react, one of the Tibetan mastiffs rushed toward her and bit into her cheek. She struggled and cried for Nales's help. "Ah! Help me, save me!" Nales stared at her indifferently, and after a while, he raised his pistol and fired. After the loud gunshot, the Tibetan mastiff let off a sharp whine and fell to the ground. Chapter 2582. The other Tibetan mastiff that sprinted toward him was shot to death too. The other two men who got mauled were lying in a pool of their own blood and were on the brink of dying. Nales saw Daisy hiding in the cage, and his pupils constricted instantly. "Daisy!" Daisy opened the door of the iron cage. Her face looked pale, and she crawled out of the cage weakly. Nales hurried forward, hugged her in his arms, and kissed her on the top of her head. "Are you okay?" She shook her head and did not say anything. She was obviously frightened by the scene of the Tibetan Mastiff mauling those men to the verge of death, so she could only lean against his arms at that moment. Cecilia covered her cheek and yelped bitterly, but she did not forget to vent her hatred while suffering from the excruciating pain. "Daisy Vanderbilt, you bitch! How dare you play tricks on me? I won't let this slide. I'll definitely kill you." Ah! The police and paramedics arrived just in time to hear what Cecilia had just said. The medical staff put down a stretcher and lifted Cecilia, whose hands had been handcuffed by the police. Cecilia struggled ferociously and refused to lay still, swearing throughout the whole process, so much so that the medical staff had no choice but to give her a sedative. The two seriously injured men in the house were also taken away, and a police officer walked toward Nales. "Your Highness, we might have to ask you to come with us to the precinct to help with the investigation." Nales nodded. He then helped Daisy to the car and got in with her. Daisy had calmed down and raised her head. "Where's Mia?" Nales rested his chin on the top of her head. "Don't worry, the bodyguards have rescued her. She's only a little frightened but not injured." Daisy finally felt more at ease. Bianca rushed to the hospital immediately when she learned that the police had arrested her daughter. In the corridor, two police officers were stationed at the ward's door while Captain Burke reported the progress of the investigation to Nales. Bianca hurried over with the support of the butler, and she looked as if she was extremely stuporous. "Where's Cecilia?" Captain Burke greeted her with a slight nod. "Mrs. Taylor. Miss Taylor is now in the operation theater, undergoing surgery. However, we'll bring her into custody after the procedure is over." Bianca grabbed Captain Burke's arm and asked emotionally, "What did she do? Why would she be detained?" Captain Burke replied with an unchanged expression, "Miss Taylor is suspected of kidnapping, and the princess and her attendant are the victims." Bianca's body swayed as she listened, and she almost fainted. If it were not for the butler's support, she would have collapsed to the ground. How did this? Her husband was detained for investigation, and her daughter was suspected of being a kidnapper. After this series of events, Blanca felt as if the sky had fallen and became pale and powerless. She suddenly knelt in front of Nales. "Your Highness, I know that Cecilia has committed a crime. We're at fault for not educating her well. I'll do anything to atone for her sins. I'll also apologize for her. I don't ask you to forgive her, but all I have left now is Cecilia, so please forgive her for her sins." She did not have the slightest shred of hope that her husband would be released, but her daughter was her life. Nales's gloomy and profound gaze did not give off any emotion. "Mrs. Taylor, you should know that ever since she chose to go down this path, she's not in the position to blame anyone for what's going to happen to her. If I forgive her, will she reform and become a better person because of my forgiveness? Have I not given her a chance before this? Every chance I've given her so far has only caused her to try even harder to achieve what she wants, hurting my wife. So, do you still think I should forgive her?" Bianca looked dazed and could not speak a word, as if something was stuck in her throat. Nolachi glanced at the butler standing behind Bianca and suggested meaningfully, "Of course, I can forgive her for her crime. But she still has to undergo trial and accept any amount of imprisonment that the judge sentences her to. As for how many years she'll be sentenced to, it depends solely on what you will do after this." Chapter 2583. Bianca was flustered. "What do you want?" Nales smiled and continued indifferently. "Then you might have to sacrifice your husband's lifelong freedom in exchange for a few years' worth of commutation for your daughter." The butler's expression changed immediately, but he did not dare to make a sound. However, Nales just so happened to catch the change in his expression. Bianca lowered her gaze, and her face was filled with pain and agony. Nales left the hospital and got into the car. Daisy was sitting in the car with his coat draped over her shoulders, waiting for his return. It was obvious that her complexion had recovered a little. "Nales, how did things go up there?" He took her into his arms. "Everything's fine. How about you? How are you feeling?" "I'm feeling much better now. It's just that I'm not used to watching those scenes live." He lowered his head and kissed the top of her head. "Then let's go home first. She nodded since she was starting to feel sleepy too. At Blue Valley Manor, Nalles carried Daisy upstairs, entered the bedroom, and gently placed her on the bed. The butler stood at the door. "Sir." Nalles covered her with the quilt, walked out of the bedroom, and asked him in the corridor, "Is there any progress with the house minister?" The butler replied, he learned that his wife and daughter had been taken away and suspected that it had something to do with the Taylors. He's given up Lord Taylor's foreign account, but Lord Taylor still refuses to admit it. Nalles's gaze dimmed. It doesn't matter if he doesn't want to admit it. He's going down as soon as we get our hands on the evidence. On the other side of town, in the detention center. After the Taylor's butler left the hospital, he went straight to the detention center. Lucius met him in the public visitation room and asked him to find a way to arrange for his wife and daughter to travel abroad. However, seeing the indescribable expression on the butler's face, he frowned. "Did something happen out there?" "Sir, Miss Taylor has been arrested by the police on suspicion of kidnapping." "I'm afraid there's nothing I can do." "What?" Lucius' face turned gloomy. "She's suspected of kidnapping. Has she lost her mind?" "Damn that girl. All she knows is how to create more trouble." The butler added cautiously, "In addition to that, ma'am may choose to betray you in order to help Miss Taylor." Lucius was astonished but did not utter a single word for a long time. At the end of the session, the butler was stopped by several plainclothes officers as soon as he came out of the detention center. Captain Burke took out his badge and said, "Mr. Carey Duval, someone has informed us about you being involved in a murder case. Please, come with us." Carey's expression changed instantly. He took 2 steps back and immediately fled into the corridor. "Stop." The officers went after him, trying to catch up. At the intersection, Carey was caught off guard by a car and rammed right into it. The officers finally caught up to him, subdued him to the ground, and handcuffed him. 2 days later, at Blue Valley Manor, Freya bought a box of pecan pie and came to the manor to pay a visit to Daisy. "I heard that Cecilia will be tried next week. The stocks of all the Taylors' businesses have plummeted sharply recently, and it's estimated that they'll go bankrupt very soon. I just don't understand. They're such a huge and powerful family, but they insist on playing with fire and digging their own graves." Tisk, 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 what a pity. Daisy smiled and leaned back into the chair. "That's why we should always be content with what we have. With such high status and power, the Taylors might not have fallen to this point if it had not been for their boundless ambitions." Freya sat down. "How is Mia doing?" Daisy responded, although she got badly frightened. "She's been doing fine. She's with her brother in the hospital now." Freya took her hand. "No matter what, it's fortunate that you and the baby are fine." Daisy smiled and nodded. Nalles and Colton stepped into the living room at this moment, and Daisy got up. "Colton, Nalles." Freya also got up and crossed her arms. "It seems that we're going to get some good news, am I right?" Chapter 2584. It's indeed good news. Colton stopped beside Freya and glanced at Nalles and Daisy. "At least the result isn't too bad." Nalles hugged Daisy and smiled. "It's all thanks to you, Colton." The servant prepared a sumptuous lunch, and the 4 of them ate at the dining table, not forgetting to bring a few bottles of wine to the table to add to the fun. However, Daisy could only replace her wine with fruit juice. Freya swayed the wine glass in her hand and said, "The problems that the Taylors brought to the table have been solved. I didn't expect so many ministers in the cabinet to be impeached. So, I guess it's time for a huge change, right?" The ending that the Taylors deserved could not be changed, and the fate of the few ministers who were associated with the Taylors suffered their shares too. Not only did their privately embezzled property get confiscated, but they also lost their opportunity to restore their positions in the cabinet. It was equivalent to being banned from getting involved in any government affair for the rest of their lives, and all their relatives would never be hired to. Nalles fetched Daisy food. The members of the cabinet should have been replaced a long time ago. "We're only offering an opportunity for them to retire early now," Freya said with a chuckle. "Compared to Lucius Taylor's downfall, retirement really looks a lot more attractive." At this time, Colton's cell phone rang. He took it out and took a glance at the caller ID. "It's Dad." He got up and went to the side to answer the call. When Colton returned after answering the call, Daisy asked, "Colton, why did Dad call?" Colton frowned. "He and Mom are coming to Yamore soon." Daisy was startled for a moment and then laughed out loud. "Isn't it a pleasure that both Dad and Mom are coming over?" The corner of Colton's lips twitched. "It might be pleasurable for you, but it means it's time for me to return." "Oh yeah," Daisy sneered. "But you've stayed in Yamore with Freya for so long. Meanwhile, you've left the whole company to Waylon alone. It's really time for you to go back. Shut your trap." Freya drank the wine slowly. No one knew what the thoughts that flashed across her mind at the moment were. After lunch, Colton and Freya left the manor. While they were returning, Freya took a glimpse at Colton. "Actually, you should go back to Zelakova. There's really no need for you to stay here and wait with me for so long." Colton frowned, turned his head, and glared at her. "Are you trying to drive me away now?" "No," she smiled and looked out the car window. "You can't just put your work aside because of me, can you? Besides, I can still return to accompany you and Charm during my breaks too, can't I?" Initially, when she insisted on coming back and signing up for the postgraduate program, she did not think Colton would come all the way to Yamore to find her. It was rare for such a career-oriented man to spend such a long time with her in Yamore. Colton stretched his arms across her shoulders. "Are you letting me go willingly?" She paused for a split second and then looked up at him with a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Of course." Colton laughed out of anger. "I think it's time to teach you another lesson." Freya leaned against his shoulder. "To be honest, I miss Charm a lot. I'm afraid that she won't be able to recognize me anymore when I return." She had to come back to Yamore for the postgraduate program as soon as she gave birth to her baby, so she did not get the chance to spend much time with her daughter. For that reason, she could not help but feel guilty about that. Colton tightened his embrace around her shoulders. "That won't be the case. When I get back, I'll let her FaceTime with you every day so that she can listen to your voice and see you. How does that sound?" Freya rested her chin on his shoulder, looked at him, and smiled. "Sounds great." Back in Basburg, at the Goldman mansion, Nolan was sitting on the couch reading magazines and gently swaying the cradle beside him with his free hand. It had taken him quite a while to finally comfort Charm, but she started crying again before he could get some peace. Chapter 2585. Nolan put down the magazine, looked at Charm, who was crying and kicking her legs in the cradle, and frowned, but there was not even a hint of anger in his eyes. "You little imp, are you deliberately defying me?" Nicholas walked down the stairs with a thermos in his hand. "You're nowhere near as good as your grandfather when it comes to raising children at home. Father can at least coax her, and she'll stop crying once he's at it." Nolan picked Charm up and held her in his arms. "You can't comfort her well either. Aren't you just like me?" Nicholas was so angry that he was speechless. Charm was still crying, and very loudly this time around. Nolan rubbed Charm's wet diaper. It seemed that she had soiled herself, so he asked one of the servants to bring Charm upstairs and change her diaper. "Sure enough, it's time for me to summon her father back." Nicholas drank water from his thermos and chuckled. "Who told you not to participate in the birth and infancy of your triplets? That's why you don't know your way around coaxing a child. You totally deserve this. This brat is finally getting the retribution that he deserves for his absence back then via his granddaughter." Thinking of something, Nicholas sat on the couch unhurriedly. "I wonder how many babies Daisy is pregnant with. If she's having 3 like Z did, the mansion will get extremely lively very soon." Nolan frowned. He could already imagine the scene where he was surrounded by a group of rascals calling him Grandpa. That would be a real headache. "By the way, are you going to Yamore with Z soon?" Nolan straightened his coat and affirmed lightly. "We haven't formally visited the Knolls yet, so it's about time." Nicholas nodded. "The Knolls are now a royal family. I heard that Nalace's mother, Queen Diana, is good at governing the country and has the demeanor of a ruler. Daisy and Nalace have already gotten married. As Daisy's family, it's time for us to visit our in-laws." After saying that, Nicholas continued. "And your grandmother, you should remember to visit her too." Nolan responded with a hum. "In Basburg's private elementary school. After school, Chadwick came out of the school with his bag in hand. He waited at the school gate for a while and took a glimpse at the smartwatch on his wrist. As usual, Daddy and Mommy are so busy today that they've forgotten to pick me up. But who cares? I've already gotten used to this. While he was on his way back, he encountered a few young female bullies who were surrounding a girl in the corner of an alley. The girl leading the pack had red hair, a row of earrings, and a purse in her hand. "Where's the money?" The girl who got surrounded in the corner did not speak. She threw the purse at the girl. "It seems that you're not taking my words seriously, Sapphire Fannin. Didn't I tell you that you must pay us at least $50 a week for protection?" Sapphire replied, "I don't have the money." The girl slapped her, and a red mark appeared on Sapphire's cheek. However, she did not even give off a hint of fear through her gaze. Instead, she glared at her. "What are you staring at? Do you believe that I'll gouge your eyes out?" The girl grabbed her by the collar. "How would you not have the money? Who doesn't know that your family is filthy rich? I'll warn you for the last time. Don't act like you're some sassy chick when you're before me. You'd better turn up with $50 tomorrow, not a penny less. Otherwise, I'll hit you every time I see you." Sapphire abruptly pushed her away forcefully. "If I tell you that I don't have the money, it means that I don't have it. How dare you push me?" The girl was irked. Just when she was about to make a move on Sapphire, a voice came from behind. "If you lay another finger on her, I'll call the police right now." The bullies turned around and saw that it was a boy. The smartwatch on Chadwick's wrist had a communication function, and he had already dialed a 9 on the screen. "Who's that brat? How dare he meddle in our business?" The red-haired girl pointed at Chadwick and yelled, "Hey, if you don't want to die, get out of here." Chapter 2586. Chadwick held his smartwatch close to his lips. 911, someone's fighting here. The red-haired girl rushed forward. "You brat, how dare you dial 911? Before Chadwick could react, he was violently pushed to the ground. His bag was dropped, and everything was scattered on the ground. He gnashed his teeth, got up, and fought with the girl. However, his strength was not the same as a 16 or 17-year-old youngster, especially when there were a few of them. The red-haired girl rolled up her sleeves. "You fucker, you actually have the balls to fight back. I'll have to teach you a lesson today." The red-haired girl was about to step forward but was suddenly embraced from behind by Sapphire, holding her back. At that moment, Sapphire shouted to Chadwick, "Why are you still standing there? Run!" The person standing next to the red-haired girl raised her foot and kicked Sapphire out of the way. Sapphire fell to the ground, and her palm hit the steps, causing it to lacerate. "Sapphire!" The red-haired girl groaned and grabbed Chadwick by the collar. "Oh, so you two know each other. If that's the case, this just made my day a lot easier. You guys just messed with the wrong person today. No one is getting away without a scratch or two." At that moment, a can flew across the air and hit the red-haired teenager on the forehead. She staggered a few steps backward and got supported by the friends who were behind her. She then shouted, "Who's that?" Chadwick quickly got up, came to Sapphire's side, helped her, and then looked at the woman walking toward those girls. He was shocked by what he saw. Coach Southern. Cameron threw the empty bottle and can in her hand up into the air, squinted, and smirked. "It's fine by me if you girls don't want to study hard at school and play gangster after school. But it's bad if you don't even play by the code when you're playing gangster. You girls chose to blackmail elementary school students. Why don't you choose someone more of your size?" The red-haired girl snorted and gnashed her teeth. "Who the fuck are you? How dare you meddle in our business? Do you know who my boss is?" "Oh." Cameron stopped fiddling with the bottle and raised her eyebrows. "There's someone even more powerful supporting you from behind the curtains." The red-haired girl became smug instantly. "My boss is in charge of the entire East Street, and his backer is the infamous Mr. Selfridge. Now, do you still have the guts to offend me after hearing his name?" "Mr. Selfridge." Cameron paused for a bit, seeming to think of someone. "Oh, so your backer is Mr. Selfridge, the loser I beat into a pulp in the martial arts training center." The red-haired girl was taken aback in an instant. Boss told me that Mr. Selfridge is the champion of a martial arts competition, but this woman actually has the balls to lie about beating him in a fight. What nonsense are you talking about, you old hag? Do you really think that I'll believe you? I strongly advise you to mind your own business and leave at this instance. Upon hearing the term, old hag, Cameron's face immediately dimmed. She gritted her teeth and scoffed. What did you just call me? I actually got called an old hag by some youngsters. She crushed the tin can in her hand. Those teenagers trembled in fright. Even the red-haired girl did not dare to act too arrogantly now. I'm warning you. If you so much as dare to lay a finger on us, my boss will never let this slide. Cameron cracked her knuckles. I won't hit young girls. Ask your boss to find me at the Martial Arts Training Center. By the way, my name is Cameron Southern, and I'll be waiting for you at the training center at any time of the day. Those youngsters left some harsh words behind and scurried away from the scene instantly. Looking at their fleeing figures, Cameron shook her head. It's a pity that they're investing their time in such pointless actions instead of studying at such a young age. Coach Southern. Hearing Chadwick's calling, Cameron turned her head with a smile. Only then did she notice that there was a girl who was a few inches taller than him beside him. Chadwick asked her, "Why are you here?" Cameron scratched her cheeks. "I can say I'm doing so because I want to take him in as my apprentice. I've been following him around and paying attention to his every action. This would make me sound a lot like a stalker." Chapter 2587. However, this little fella wants to learn martial arts at such a young age. Could it be that he just can't stay put when injustice presents itself? I was just passing by. After saying that, Cameron walked up to the two of them, leaned over, looked at Chadwick, and placed her hands on his shoulders. You acted very bravely at such a young age. That's a good thing. I like it. Chadwick lowered his head and did not utter a single word. Sapphire tugged on the hem of Chadwick's clothes at this moment and said in a soft voice, "We should say thank you to this lady here. She helped us." Although Chadwick seemed awkward and reluctant, he still mustered the courage to thank Cameron. Cameron looked down at her watch and stood back up. "It's getting late already. How about I see you off?" "No, we'll go back by ourselves." Chadwick grabbed Sapphire's hand, walked past Cameron, and left the scene. Sapphire looked back at Cameron and tried to hold Chadwick back. "Chadwick, she helped us. We can't just leave her alone. She's an adult now. Someone else will take care of her." Cameron hissed when she heard what the little fella said. How can this little brat be so arrogant? Chadwick and Sapphire walked to the side of the road and waited for a taxi. Cameron caught up to them in a few steps, walked slowly up to them, and stood behind them. "Oh, are you going to take a cab home? Aren't you afraid of running into bad guys?" Chadwick turned to look at her, and his brows creased. "Why are you following us?" Cameron crossed her arms. "I'm your coach, so of course, I'm responsible for your safety." Sapphire glanced at Chadwick. "Chadwick, why don't we let her send us back?" Chadwick did not say anything. Cameron leaned over, looked at them, and laughed. "Chadwick, I'd listen to this young girl if I were you. After all, I can't be sure if those people from just now will show up again or not. With your martial arts skills, are you sure you can protect this pretty senior of yours? This little fella looks promising. He's already thinking about protecting his senior at this age. He's indeed the apprentice that I'm looking for." Chadwick pondered for a long time and responded, "Okay, you can send us home as you want." Cameron left briefly, drove her car over, and the two kids got into the car. Chadwick turned his head away and looked out the car window. "We'll send Sapphire back home first." Cameron took a glance at the two children through the rearview mirror and replied with a smile, "All right, give me the address. I'll get the GPS going." After Sapphire told Cameron her address, Cameron drove according to the route pointed out by the GPS, and three of them arrived at Sapphire's house soon after. Sapphire got out of the car and did not forget to wave to Cameron. "See you, Miss Southern." She then looked at the boy sitting in the rear. "Chadwick, you be careful too." Chadwick responded in a muffled voice, "Yeah." Cameron watched as the little girl entered her house, then looked back at Chadwick. Boy, are you learning martial arts because of her? That's none of your business. Cameron smiled, turned the car around, and drove away. It's not surprising to me that a man has someone that he wants to protect. But you're still young. All you need is a few more years of practice to improve your skills. Then you'll be able to resolve today's problem with a snap of your fingers. Chadwick withdrew his gaze and stared at Cameron. Then why are you following me? I'm not dumb. It's impossible for Coach Southern to pass by our school, and I've run into her way too frequently recently. So how can I not suspect her of some fishy business? The corners of Cameron's lips twitched as she forced a smile. I only want to know why you would insist on asking Nick to be your master. So, are you stalking me? Ahem? Cameron said seriously. How is this stalking? I'm only secretly observing you. Moreover, if I hadn't followed you around, you too would have been doomed earlier today. Chadwick pursed his lips and said nothing. I thought I would become more powerful by practicing martial arts. But this theory is only applicable to peers around the same age. I stand no chance against those who are older than me. Chapter 2588. I have no other choice but to grow up faster. Cameron glanced in the rearview mirror and caught the slight disappointment on his face. Frankly speaking, there's no need for you to feel discouraged. You're still young. How long have you been learning martial arts? There are people out there who have been practicing martial arts for more than a decade and still find it difficult to bring their opponents down when they get engaged in fights or matches. So what do you expect to achieve in less than a year? Chadwick pursed his lips and remained silent. Cameron smiled. Why not just take me in as your coach? I promise that I'll train you well and shape you into whoever you want to be. Chadwick leaned back into the seat. Then I might as well ask Coach Wickham to train me. Cameron's expression became more restrained. You're so mean. Chadwick snorted and turned his face away. The car arrived at the Busha Manor, and Chadwick got out of the car. At that moment, the butler hurried out. Young master, where have you been? Master Busha went to your school and waited for you, but he didn't see you at all. Chadwick flung his bag onto his shoulder and walked past the butler. Instead of waiting for him to come and pick me up, I would have already gotten home long ago if I were to use the time to walk home. The butler was helpless and caught up to him in a hurry. Young master, please be more considerate of Master Busha. He's been very busy recently. Cameron watched them step into the courtyard, sighed, and leaned back in the driver's seat. Jesus, kids nowadays are really a pain in the ass. Is it so hard for me to find myself an apprentice? Her cell phone rang all of a sudden. It was Waylon. At Emperin, Cameron stood in the entryway and changed out of her shoes. Dinner had already been prepared, and all the dishes were served on the table. Waylon came out of the kitchen with a bowl of pumpkin soup at that moment. What have you been doing with Chadwick lately? Cameron was stunned for a moment. How do you know that? He placed the soup on the table and looked up at Cameron. How could I not know about that? My wife leaves the house so early in the morning and returns so late in the evening, and she often appears around the private elementary school where Chadwick attends school. If that's not suspicious, what is? She sat at the table with a slightly embarrassed expression and picked up a piece of braised pork with her fork. I want to know why the young heir of the butchers wants Nick to be his coach. He's a boy who's born with a silver spoon in his mouth and is not in need of anything, so why drag himself through so much training? That doesn't make sense, right? Waylon sat down at the dining table too and gave off a smug expression as if he had seen through her. You really want to take him in as your apprentice, huh? Cameron responded earnestly. He has great potential and is not learning martial arts in order to overpower others. It just so happens that he's doing so to protect the people that he wants to protect. It is a good thing to have such ambition at such a young age. She then thought of something and continued. By the way, he almost got bullied today. Don't the butchers arrange for a bodyguard to follow him around when he goes out? Thank God that I was there. Otherwise, he would have Waylon picked up a piece of pork rib, stuffed it into her mouth, and smiled. Eat your dinner first. Cameron chewed on the rib and spat the bone onto the plate. Are Chadwick's parents very busy with their work? I think he must lack parental love. Otherwise, how could he be so indifferent at such a young age? If he were my son, I wouldn't even think twice about bringing him everywhere I go. Waylon's hands stopped moving, and he lifted his gaze slightly, stared at the chattering woman for a long time, put down his silverware, and stood up. Cameron glanced at him suspiciously. He picked her up before she had the time to say anything. She was astounded. "What are you doing?" Waylon sneered softly. "Seeing how much you care about someone else's son, why don't we create one ourselves?" Cameron choked on her own words and smacked him repeatedly. "I didn't say I want one. Wayne Goldman, let me down." Waylon carried her upstairs. Her desperate cry came from upstairs. "I haven't even finished my meal yet." Back in Yamore, at Blue Valley Manor, Daisy stood in the courtyard and stared at the gate. Mia came out with a coat and draped it over her shoulders. "Ma'am, why don't you go in and wait?" Chapter 2589. Daisy wrapped the coat around her and gave off a grin. "I'm fine. I'll wait a little longer. Mom and Dad are coming today, and I really miss them so much." Not long after, 3 limousines drove into the manor slowly and stopped in the courtyard. The moment Maisie got out of the car, Daisy dashed toward her. "Mom!" Maisie hugged her and could not help but laugh out loud. "You're someone who's about to become someone else's mother, so why are you still running around like a 10-year-old? But I missed you so much." Daisy leaned against Maisie in her arms. Maisie stroked her hair as usual. "I missed you very much too. Knowing that something happened to you, your dad and I have been very worried about you." At that moment, Nolan got out of the car with Nalace and cleared his throat. That was when Daisy walked over and hugged him. "Dad." Nolan pinched her cheek. "You've gained quite some weight. It seems that someone is taking good care of you." Nalace, the someone who got pointed out, chuckled. "You handed Daisy's hand to me, so it's only natural for me not to want to let you down." Maisie took the suitcase from Nolan. "All right, it's cold out here. Let's go inside." The butler and Mia walked up to them and grabbed the luggage from them, and Nalace invited them into the manor. In the living room, the maid brewed tea and brought it to the table. Nolan held the ear of the cup and tasted the tea while Maisie looked around. "This place looks very clean." Sitting beside her, Daisy explained with a smile, "This is Nalace's grandmother's manor. Nalace said it's suitable for a pregnant woman." Maisie scratched the tip of her nose and said in a reprimanding tone, "It may be suitable for pregnant ladies, but it still won't be able to house you if you go around risking your own life. Don't you know that it's dangerous to do what you did?" They naturally knew that Daisy had almost lost her baby. But they were far away from her, living all the way back in Zelakova. They could not be by her side, and it was even more impossible for them to get here immediately if something were to happen. When Maisie heard the news, she was terrified, for fear that something bad would happen to their daughter. Daisy pursed her lips and whispered, "I'm sorry to have made you worry." Nolan put down his teacup and stared calmly at Nalace. "Has everything been resolved?" Nalace nodded. "Of course. I wouldn't feel at ease keeping Daisy here if this matter hadn't been resolved." Maisie smiled happily. "I still want to thank you for protecting Daisy so well. Daisy grew up around us and has been spoiled by everyone from the Goldmans, so she's never seen just how cruel this world can be. However, it's fortunate that she was able to learn very quickly when she was growing up and has become the independent woman she is today. Now that she's married to you, I'm very glad that you can take such good care of her. Daisy has always been the princess of the Goldmans throughout her whole childhood and adolescence." Back then, Nolan didn't want Daisy to get too close to Nalace because he felt that Nalace's background was way too complicated. What's more, Nalace is from Yamore. So if Daisy were to be wronged in Yamore, we, as her parents, wouldn't be able to travel here to show her support in time, and if Nalace were to treat her badly and make her sad, we wouldn't know anything about it either. But now, I can see that Daisy does have an eye for the right man. At least Nalace is indeed worthy of me entrusting my daughter to him." "Mom, you're flattering me now." Nalace looked at Daisy with a hint of doting affection flashing across his eyes. "I knew she was the woman I wanted to marry and protect for the rest of my life ever since she chose to risk her life for mine back then. So as long as I'm alive, I'll never let her down." Daisy turned and stared at Nolan and Maisie. "Mom, Dad, don't worry. Nolachi treats me so well that I'll never leave him, no matter what happens. Nolachi protected her continuously, and in return, she continued to stay by his side. It was just that simple. However, although it might look simple, it was still a remarkable thing to achieve. Chapter 2590. Maisie stroked Daisy's hair and laughed. I know that you're happy when you're with Nolly. That's why your father and I don't really worry about your marriage. At noon, Daisy accompanied Maisie for a stroll in the garden, wrapping her arm around Maisie's. Mom, for how long will you and Dad stay? Maisie teased her. Why ask? Do you want us to leave already? That's not true. She shook her head and leaned on Maisie's shoulder after saying that. It'd be nice if you and Dad could stay here longer. Your father and I will only stay here for half a month. Your father will go to Uncle Yorick's place tomorrow to visit your great-grandmother. After explaining Nolan's schedule to her, Maisie turned to face Daisy. Maybe you can come with me to pay Freya and her father a visit tomorrow. After all, Freya is now the Goldman's daughter-in-law, and she has also given birth to Charm for Cole. So it's definitely time for me to meet my in-law already. Daisy smiled and nodded. Okay, then I will go with you tomorrow. The next day, Maisie and Daisy arrived at Brandon's villa to meet him. Brandon enthusiastically entertained them and invited them to stay back for lunch while he asked the servants to prepare for it. Upon seeing that he had not even prepared any gifts for the Goldmans, Brandon's expression looked extremely embarrassed as he apologized. Freya is still on campus, and Coleman has gone out, so I'm the only one at home. Your visit caught me off guard a little, and I've not prepared anything to welcome you. I'm so sorry. Maisie smiled. There's no need for that, Mr. Pruitt. You're Freya's father, and Freya is my daughter-in-law. We're a family now, so there's no need for you to go to that extent just because we're coming over to pay you a visit. Brandon lowered his gaze and said earnestly, Freya is a good kid. I actually feel guilty whenever I see her. But I can see that she's now leading a happy life, and I must say that I feel very relieved. I wasn't able to give Freya what she wanted back then, so I've always worried that the Goldmans would look down on her. It wasn't until I saw how Coleman treats Freya that I realized that I was so narrow-minded. The reason he thought so at the beginning was that the Goldmans were an extremely prestigious family. As a father, he had failed to give Freya the status she deserved, which was why he feared that Freya would not be happy after getting married to the Goldmans. But judging from the kindness and affection that Colton had been showing Freya, it was not difficult for him to see that Colton really loved his daughter. At least he was not playing with her feelings. Maisie looked at Brandon. Actually, I don't pay much attention to someone's status and identity. I focus more on someone's connotation and attitude. Freya is really a great young lady. At least she knows what she wants and has a fire in her. The most important thing is that she has a kind heart. I heard that she received a huge inheritance from the late King William, but the first thing that came to her mind was to set up a foundation to help improve the conditions of nursing homes, and she did so. Without asking for anything in return. Many people would have remained stingy with the massive amount of money they have for their personal benefits. These show that I have an eye for the people I allow into my life. To be able to marry Freya is surely Cole's blessing. At least that's what I think and believe. Brandon was slightly taken aback. It seemed that he did not expect Maisie to think so highly of his daughter. However, when his in-law was this satisfied with his daughter, perhaps he should be proud of having such a daughter too. Mom, when Colton learned of Maisie's visit, he rushed back home immediately, and it turned out to be true. Daisy approached him. Colton, did you go out just to cling to Freya again? Coleman cleared his throat and lowered his voice. What do you mean by cling? You're the clingier one out of us two. How dare this girl ridicule me? Maisie looked back at the two siblings. Are you bickering again? One of you is already a father, and the other is a mother-to-be. How are you two still so childish?